Open your Bible, if you would, to the book of Genesis, and let's go to chapter 39. Genesis 39. Our Bible reading this morning was from Acts chapter 7. And did you notice when Todd was reading Acts 7 for us about Joseph and his time in Egypt, in verse 14 of Acts 7, it said, in your translation, it might have said that there were 75 people who went to Egypt, whereas Genesis says there were 70 people. And don't be too bothered by that. The Septuagint translation, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, says 75, and that's most likely what Stephen was quoting from when he was preaching in Acts chapter 7. And maybe it says 75 with good reason. That would seem to indicate that there would be other members of Joseph's family that were included as well, and that's where that number came from. But maybe you have a footnote that said, or 70 or 75. Don't be too troubled by those different numbers. But we've been focusing in our Bible class about Joseph here lately, and I wanted to say some things about Joseph that I have not emphasized very much in our Bible class. Joseph is one of the great men of the Bible. He is a type, a foreshadowing figure of Jesus in many ways. Let me just list a few of the parallels that exist between Joseph and Jesus. He and Jesus were both objects of special love by their fathers. Both of them were hated and rejected by their brethren. Both of them were conspired against and sold for silver, specifically sold for the price of a slave. Both of them were condemned, though they were innocent. Both of them were raised from humiliation to glory by the power of God. There are a number of parallels between Joseph and his life and the life of Jesus. In fact, just last Sunday, a sermon was preached by Brother Ralph Walker. Many of you will remember Ralph. He did a meeting for us not too long ago, and I just stumbled across this sermon that he preached last week where he went through, 21 points. 21 parallels between Joseph and Jesus. You can find that sermon at their website. I feel kind of odd promoting another preacher's sermon during my own. Please don't go searching for that sermon now. Henderson Boulevard, you can look at their website and you can find that. I commend that sermon. It's excellent, but that's not my purpose this morning. Joseph's life was one of tremendous faith, despite a number of reasons to not have faith. He suffered harsh ill treatment in his life. But his life was one that despite those problems and despite that suffering, Joseph lived with a very keen awareness of God's activity in his life. And I want to emphasize that with you this morning. I want us to see through Joseph, what does it mean to live a life that is conscious of God? Do you think about God every day? Do you think about God in all of your decisions, in all of your actions? Do you consider Him as you go throughout your life? Joseph did. And he shows us at different points in life how to have a consciousness of God. So we start in chapter 37 with the story, but we're going to begin reading in 39 in just a moment. But remember that Joseph was despised by his brothers in 37, and he was sold into slavery so they could get rid of him. Genesis 37 and verse 2 says that he was 17 years old when this occurred. And I realize that this is a review of what we've gone over in our Bible class, and so much of this I'm just going to run through very quickly. So in the process of time, Joseph makes his way to Egypt and he becomes the servant of a man named Potiphar. In chapter 39 and verse 1, it says, Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph. We emphasize this in our class, that it doesn't appear that the Lord is with Joseph, but he is. And Joseph is going to have a consciousness of that, because Joseph helps us understand that we need to have a consciousness of God even in times of temptation. So as Joseph is in Potiphar's house, he becomes a great servant in Potiphar's house. His master sees in verse 3 that the Lord was with Joseph and how God caused all that Joseph did to prosper. Potiphar is blessed by having Joseph in his house. And he sees that God is with Joseph. But while Joseph is serving in Potiphar's house, in verse 7 it says that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." She makes repeated sexual advances toward Joseph. In verse 10, it says that she spoke to Joseph day after day. This was not just a one-time event. She was coming after him every single day. And I want you to understand that Joseph's temptations that he is facing from Potiphar's wife, it would have been very difficult to withstand. Think about how easy it would have been for Joseph to get away with it. He is far from home. His father, to whom he would be accountable, is miles away. He is far from his home, far away from anyone who cares about him or anyone who would even know about it, so long as these two can keep it a secret. Potiphar's wife is his superior. Yes, her husband is his superior, but he's a servant in Potiphar's house. And she is a big part of Potiphar's house. And so she too is going to have command over him. Joseph's job was to be a servant to his master Potiphar, but included in that would be to do the things that Potiphar's wife needs done around the estate and around the house. But there are some things that are off limits, and Joseph understood that. You could even possibly perceive some benefit or some advantage gained for Joseph. Well, she's after me day after day, and if I just give her what she wants, then maybe she'll make my life easier. Maybe there will be some other benefits that will come along with this. If I can just make her happy, maybe things will get even better than they are for me right now. I have my master's respect and appreciation, but I could also have his wife's assistance, generosity, whatever it is that he may gain. Surely Joseph could have thought, I need to just give her what she wants. It will make my job that much easier. But he refused all of her advances. And I love what is said by Joseph in verse 9. He says, "There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. My master has given into my hand everything in his house except one thing, and that's because I don't have a right to you. You're his wife." And he says, "How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? You are my master's wife. How could I do this great evil and sin against my master?" You know, we might have expected Joseph to say that, because that would be true. He'd be sinning against his master. But Joseph has a consciousness of God. And he says, if I do this, I will be sinning Not just against my master, not just against Potiphar's wife, not just against myself. I am sinning ultimately against God. You remember what David said in Psalm 51? Right after he's had his episode with Bathsheba, he pours out his soul to God in Psalm 51, and he says, against you and you only I have sinned. Now we know that that's not literally true. He sinned against Bathsheba, he sinned against himself, he sinned against his nation, but he says, ultimately, God, it's you that I've sinned against. Joseph understood that concept. He understood the consequences of committing this sin. There are temporal consequences to this temptation. What if I go through with this and my master finds out about it? Well, what kinds of consequences are going to come upon me with that? But there are even more serious consequences. There are eternal consequences here. How can I commit this great evil and sin against God? I'm going to Proverbs chapter 7. Keep your finger here in Genesis. We'll come back. But Proverbs 7. Joseph understood the warning of Proverbs 7. A warning which the young man in Proverbs 7 did not understand. Proverbs 7 and verse 24, Solomon says, now therefore, my sons, listen to me and pay attention to the words of my mouth. Do not let your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. For many are the victims she has cast down, and numerous are all her slain. Her house is the way to Sheol, descending to the chambers of death. This seductive, adulterous woman is described in Proverbs 7, and she is calling out to this naive young fool, the text calls him. He is a fool for going to her house and being seduced by her. Solomon says, son, you stay away from women like that. Joseph understood this. He stayed away from Potiphar's wife. In time of temptation, he thought about God. In times of our temptation, we need to think about God. We need to say, what does God say about this? What will happen to my relationship with God if I go through with this temptation? And Joseph shows us how to do that. Joseph also shows us that he was conscious of God in times of personal praise. When he was receiving praise, Joseph thought about God. Genesis 41 is where we're going. Potiphar's wife accuses Joseph of making sexual advances towards her. She accuses him of doing the very thing that she was guilty of. And Potiphar throws Joseph into prison. And he will be joined in prison by two of Pharaoh's servants, a baker and a butler. Both of these men have dreams that Joseph interprets for them. The baker's dream said that he would be killed, and 3 days later, he was. He was executed by Pharaoh. But the butler's dream said that he would be restored to his position in 3 days, and he was. And so Joseph requested, when the butler went back to his office, please don't forget about me. Remember me and tell Pharaoh to let me out of prison. And the butler says, yes, I'll do that. I will mention you. But he forgot. And so Joseph continued in prison for 2 more years. In chapter 41 and verse 1, at the end of 2 full years, Pharaoh had a dream. Pharaoh actually has 2 dreams. And the dreams have the same message, but Pharaoh doesn't understand it. He needs an interpreter. And that's when the butler remembers. I had a dream 2 years ago, and there's this Hebrew man in prison named Joseph who interpreted my dream. Pharaoh, you need to go get Joseph. You need to summon Joseph from prison. He can probably tell you what your dream is about. So in chapter 41 and verse 14, Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I've heard it about you, that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Now I want you to see what Joseph says to Pharaoh. Joseph answered Pharaoh saying, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." And Pharaoh goes on to tell him about the dreams, and then Joseph will explain. But when Pharaoh says to Joseph, I've been told that you can interpret dreams, Joseph didn't say, "Yes, I can. I'm so smart. I'm highly educated. I know everything about everything. You just sit down and get your pen and paper and take some notes because I'm going to enlighten you, Pharaoh." No, he says, "It's not within me. God can interpret these dreams." Joseph knows that it is God who gives him the ability that he has. Now go with me to Romans, the 12th chapter. The point that I want to make with us from this is that we need to have that same recognition that Joseph did. Whatever gifts, whatever abilities, whatever things we are able to do, it is because God has made it so. It is not because we are so smart. It is not because we are so strong. It is not because we are so wealthy and powerful. Whatever we have, it came to us from God. Chapter 12, look with me at verse 3. "For through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think so as to have sound judgment, as God has allotted to each a measure of faith." In verse 6, he says, "Since we have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us." All of us have something to offer because God has shed his grace on each one of us and given us different abilities. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and in verse 7, Paul asks this question. 1 Corinthians 4, verse 7. "What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as if you had not received it?" What do you have that wasn't given to you by God? And if you know that God gave it to you, then why are you acting as though you did it yourself? And so you think about God in times of personal praise. I am sure that each one of us receives personal praise for one thing or another. If you're young and you're involved in sports, you may play a great game of baseball. You may play a great soccer game and people come up to you and they say, "Oh, that was the greatest performance I've ever seen. You were so good on the mound. You were so good on the soccer field. You did such a great job. You scored 17 points and you had 9 assists and you were so great." That's personal praise. That's great. We love that. We love it when people shower us with personal praise. But then we become adults and we realize that, the sports that we played, that was fun and all those accolades and things, that was good at the time, but we're more mature now. We're older and we've taken on responsibilities now. And so then we become praised for different things. Maybe it's at your job. You work hard. You give it the best you can, and your boss comes to you and he says, "You've been doing a tremendous job here lately. I've seen how hard you've been working. I am just really glad you're on our team. And you know what? Hey, it's the end of the year. You're going to have a little Christmas bonus coming this year because I've seen the good that you've done for our company." That makes us feel good. We appreciate that kind of attention and recognition that we have put in the time and the effort, and we have worked hard. Or maybe your spouse comes to you and says, "Honey, I've just seen everything that you do to make our house operate smoothly, and you just work so hard and you do so many things for our family. I value that so much. I just really love you and I appreciate what you're doing." We love it when we receive personal praise, and all of us receive it from someone who is close to us, whether it's a spouse or parents or children or bosses, whoever it may be. When we receive praise, we need to remember Romans 12 and verse 3. "Don't think of myself more highly than I ought to think." Who taught me to work hard and to give it my best effort? Well, didn't God teach me that? Doesn't the scripture teach me to do that? Well, who taught me to be a good husband and father? Who taught me to be a good wife and mother? Doesn't God teach me that? Don't I live the way that I live because God has shown me this is how he wants me to live? You see, it all goes back to the things that God has done for us, the things that he has said to us. We would not be who we are if it wasn't for him. And Joseph understood that. It's not within me, but there is a God who can interpret these dreams. Joseph was not afraid to speak about the true God in front of Pharaoh. That's impressive in itself, isn't it? All right, Joseph also teaches us this. He was conscious of God during times of hardship. And really, Joseph's entire life, in some ways, could be characterized by hardship. Sold into slavery at the age of 17 by his brothers, and he's going to be accused wrongfully by Potiphar's wife, and he's going to go to prison, and all of these things that happened to him. Yes, there were some great moments that worked in Joseph's favor, but there were also some difficult things that he suffered through. A great famine comes upon the land, and it affects Joseph's family, and so his brothers come to Egypt seeking food. And in Genesis chapter 45, you're already there because you did what I said and you kept your finger there, but I didn't, so give me just a moment. Genesis 45, his brothers have come back this second time now to buy grain. And in chapter 45 and in verse 1, Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. And he cried out, "Have everyone go out from me." So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph." But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Joseph looked over all the things that have transpired since he was 17 years old. Here he is now 22 years later, and he looks back over this last 22 years and all the things that have happened to him, the ups and the downs and the peaks and the valleys, and he recognizes, God has been with me. In verse 5, he says to his brothers, "Do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. The famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve you for a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now, therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his household and ruler over all the land of Egypt. It was not you that sent me here, but it was God." Well, yes, it was them that sent him there. They are the ones who sold him into slavery. It is because of their jealous action that Joseph ended up in Egypt. Yes, that's true. But God was working throughout the story. And Joseph recognized that. He says, now the very people who once tried to kill me have now come before me because they need me to preserve life. Don't miss what is said in verse 7. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth. Long before, back in Genesis 12, we talked about this in class this morning, God promised Abram that from him a great nation would come. And that nation, at this point in history, has not been formed yet. It's coming out of this one family that right now needs to be preserved. This family is the family of promise. This is the family that God is going to fulfill the promises to Abraham through. And if they don't survive, what happens to the promise of God? Well, God's going to ensure that his promise will not fail. And he has orchestrated all of this to preserve this family. I'm going to Mark chapter 6. Let's think about the Lord and how he came to the aid of those whom he loved when they were in a time of hardship. In Mark chapter 6, Jesus has just fed the 5,000. And after this, verse 45, Mark 6, verse 45, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side to Bethsaida while he himself was sending the crowd away. After bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain to pray. And when it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. The disciples are out rowing in the boat. It says in the fourth watch of the night. If you look over at your footnote in your Bible, you'll see that says 3 to 6 a.m. Wee hours of the morning. The winds are strong, and the disciples are struggling to keep the boat going in the right direction. Jesus saw them struggling, and he came out to them. I think there's something very powerful and very, very comforting in that. Jesus saw them straining at the oars. He saw them struggling to overcome the winds. And Jesus sees you when you are straining at the oars, when you are facing times of hardship. He sees you struggling. But Jesus doesn't just see them and acknowledge them. Oh, well, there they are, way out there in the middle of the water. Sure hope they make it all right. Guess I'll just wait here and see. No, he gets up and miraculously begins walking on the water, but emphasize this point. He goes out to them. He goes out to them when he sees them struggling. And when Jesus sees you and me struggling, he comes out to us as well. He doesn't just acknowledge our pain. He doesn't just see our suffering, but he comes alongside us and he says, let me help you. Let me walk with you. Let me join you and carry this burden. So think about God in times of hardship like Joseph did. Do you know anybody who, when you're facing a time of hardship, you go to them and you talk to them. You share that burden with them. And their immediate response is to put their hand on your shoulder and say, let's pray about that right now. Do you know anybody like that? I hope you do. I remember one time, this was years ago, talking with someone we were out in a store. I didn't even know this person. But he recognized me from something, probably a sports league or something like that. And he came up to me and we started talking. As a total stranger. And it went the typical way. What do you do for work? I said, well, I'm a preacher with this church. Oh, you're a preacher. And so we start talking all that. And well, then this guy just lays it out, man. He just tells me his life story. And I wasn't really asking for that, but it was kind of one of those things where, you can't really walk away from the guy when he's pouring his heart out to you, So I stayed there and listened to him, and I said, wow, okay. Man, really, thank you for sharing all of this. And I felt bad about it because I was thinking, I really want to get out of this. This is kind of uncomfortable for me. I don't know this guy, and he's just laying everything bare, and I'm ready to get out of here. And then he really made me feel bad when he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, would you pray for me? And at first I thought, yeah, sure, absolutely, I'll do that. And he said, no, I mean like right now, right here. Like in the middle of the store? You just want to, all these people around, you just want to pray right here? Yeah. Okay, so we did. I prayed for that man right there in the middle of aisle 6 at the grocery store, or whatever aisle it was, doesn't matter. And I walked away from that conversation thinking, you know what? I should be more like that guy. not afraid to stop what I'm doing right in the middle of a public place, put my hand on somebody, and say a prayer. I should be more like this total stranger. I think God was teaching me something in that moment. That's a consciousness of God. That is an awareness that I need God in my life and I need Him right now. And so I'm going to call out to Him and I'm going to pray to Him now. I hope you have people in your life like that. Now let's close with this. Joseph teaches us to think about God in time of death. We haven't gotten here in our Bible class yet. So if you've been sleeping through the whole sermon, you got to wake up because this is new material. We're not there yet, all right? So go with me to Genesis chapter 50. And remember what we just said from Genesis 45, where Joseph said to his brothers, you didn't send me here, God sent me here to preserve you alive and all of that. Okay, Joseph is conscious of God throughout all of this. He's seen God's hand at work throughout his life, and he still sees it at death. We're familiar with chapter 50 and verse 20, where he repeats what he said back in chapter 45. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve people alive. But I want to focus on the last few verses of the chapter. Verse 24, Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which He promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I'm about to die. But there's one thing I know, and that is that God, who has been with me throughout all of my life, will continue to be with you throughout yours. And you're not going to stay here in the land of Egypt. You're going to go back to the land that God promised Abraham. So Joseph said in verse 25, he made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. So Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. Joseph died in a foreign land that became his home because he lived there for so many years, but still a foreign land. It was not the land of Canaan in which he was born and he grew up. And so he says to his brothers when it's time for him to die, don't leave my bones here. Take my bones back home. I want to go to the land that God promised. Now this is interesting. Go with me to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. Joseph is mentioned in this chapter. And there are some other names of men and women throughout the Bible who are mentioned in Hebrews 11. And what is said of them are some really remarkable things, impressive things, mighty deeds that these people did through the power of God. Well, let's just see what's said about Joseph. What mighty deed is recorded of Joseph? Hebrews 11, verse 22. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. That kind of anticlimactic compared to some of the other things that are said in Hebrews 11. I mean, you've got Abraham who's ready to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. That's recorded in chapter 11. Wow. But then Joseph, it calls attention to him saying, hey, listen, don't leave my bones here in Egypt. Take the box that contains my bones, carry that back to Canaan when you leave. And you think, man, of all the great moments in Joseph's life, this is what the writer says? What is that about? Well, why doesn't it record how Joseph resisted the temptation of Potiphar's wife? What a great moment that was for him. Why doesn't it mention that? Well, why doesn't it talk about how Joseph rose to power in Egypt and became this strong man in Pharaoh's house? Nope, that's not what's mentioned. What's mentioned is, don't leave my bones in Egypt. What is that about? This moment, when Joseph says to his brothers, take my bones with you when you leave this place, it is an indication of Joseph's faith and trust in God. Joseph knows that Egypt is not the land of promise, that Canaan is the land of promise. He doesn't want to be buried in Egypt. He wants to be at home. He wants to be in the land of his people. He also knows that God's people will one day leave the land of Egypt. It is mentioned in verse 22, the exodus of the sons of Israel. There's an entire book of the Bible, right, about that, the book of Exodus. Joseph knew, we are not staying here. We are leaving this place. I'm not going to live to see it, but one day our people will leave this land and go home. So Joseph knew what God's promise was, but he also knew that he would never live to see it fulfilled. It would not be in his lifetime that exodus would take place, that his people, his family, and the nation that comes from it would go into the land of Canaan. Joseph is not going to live to see that, and he knows it. But he says, hey, I want to be part of it. So take my bones with you. I want to be a part of the promises of God. I want to live in the promised land. I don't want my story to end in Egypt. I want my story to end with my bones buried in the land of promise. You see, Hebrews 11, if you look at all the things that are said about all the different people in Hebrews 11, all of them are able to see through the eyes of faith that which they would never see through the eyes of their body. They're always looking out ahead, something beyond, something that's out there, something that is out there that affects the way that they live back here. So Joseph has an awareness of God even when his life is nearly ending. But he knows God's promise. He knows that dying in Egypt is not the worst thing that could happen to him. What's even worse than dying and being buried in Egypt is staying in Egypt. Go to Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews 2 tells us that at the time of death, when I face death, when you face death, we don't have to be afraid. In Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 14, the writer says, therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself, that's Jesus, likewise also partook of the same. He became flesh and blood, like us, like the children, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all of their lives. But when I come to the time of death, I don't have to be afraid. I don't have to fear death because of what Jesus has done. And you think about Psalm 23 when David said, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Isn't that the idea? When I face death, I don't have to be afraid because of what Jesus has done. And so even in death, have a consciousness of God. Have an awareness of all that God has done to make it possible that I don't have to be scared to die, because to die really means to live, to go into eternity with the Lord. Joseph teaches us what it means to live a life with a consciousness of God every day, every word, every action. In all circumstances of life, think about God. Think about what He is doing. Think about His help and how He is there for you. Think about Him, because God thinks about us often. There may be someone here this morning who's been giving some more serious thought about God. Hannah's been doing that. On Wednesday night, Roy told me, we've been having some discussions with Hannah. I think she's thinking about it. I think she's getting close. We've had some good dialogue with Hannah. Hannah's been thinking about God. Hannah's been thinking about Jesus and what He means for her life. Maybe somebody else who's done that. Maybe you've been thinking about making your life right with God. We want to help you do that this morning. If you need to come to Him and be baptized in water for the remission of your sins, or if you need to return to Him and begin serving Him once again, we want to help you with that. And we invite you, please come forward now.